Hello, everyone. I'm Louise Chun from Welldoing, and I'm talking today to Jenny Rogers, who's the author of a new book called Are You Listening? She's an executive coach, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, coaching. So, Jenny, we have recently introduced coaching along with the therapists on Welldoing. I wonder if you could start off by explaining to us what is executive coaching?
Executive coaching is really, it's what it sounds like. It's coaching delivered to executives, meaning senior people in organizations. But underneath that, really what it is any coaching that any other coach would do, but taking into account all the bizarre trials and tribulations of being a senior person in an organization.
So would most executive coaches have worked in business to a high level?
Not all have, funnily enough. But I would say it's helpful if you have, because otherwise you would probably find a lot of what you hear really rather shocking. And it helps, I think, as well if you're familiar with management development. A lot of people come into it from having had a learning and development role in an organization. So they're familiar with things like how you delegate, what causes performance problems, how you give people feedback. Those things recur again and again.
And what would you say is the relationship between executive coaching and seeing a therapist?
Well, there may be very little difference. I think the therapist role and the coach role have, in the time I've been a coach, which is 30 years, have been coming closer together for many people. I think to answer your question at a deeper level, coaches might well see people suffering from depression or anxiety or addictions. And I think we all need to be very clear where our boundaries are on that. But I guess all therapists need to be as well.
Would you say that an executive coach focuses on work relationships?
No. I would say that an executive coach needs to focus on everything that's going on in that person's life. You mentioned my book, Are You Listening? And this is a book of stories about coaching, which are fictionalized, but they represent very typical problems. And I think in every case, the client presents with, if you like, an alibi issue, a safe issue, something to do with, say, delegation or performance management. But underneath that, there's a whole range of other problems which involve their whole lives, their marital relationships, their health, things that have gone on sometimes very early in their lives. And it's definitely not as simple as just, oh, well, I need to learn how to delegate better, or I need to know how to build my team. Those might be the starting issues because they're safe and familiar.
Career change is a common question that appears to come up in coaching.
Yeah.
For people who don't ever go to see a coach, I'm wondering if there's a sort of critical question that we could all ask ourselves about our working lives and our level of satisfaction with it.
Well, that's a really, really good question. And what I find is that where people come with a career crisis, it may be because they've been made redundant, or they're facing a disciplinary process, or they've made a mistake and they've been sacked. The question they typically ask is, who else will have me? Which is very understandable, because there's that panic about, well, I've got a mortgage, I've got children, now what am I going to do? How am I going to pay my bills? But I think the real answer to your question is, what do I really want? The clients I've worked with have found that those events, painful though they are at the time, are actually, in retrospect, welcome as an opportunity to say, what do I really want? Was I really enjoying that job? Is it time I made some kind of change anyway? Have I outgrown this job? What else is going on in my life? What have I neglected? That's the place I start.
Is goal setting always a good tactic for people at work?
No, I don't think it is. I've really never known anybody have a career plan that came to pass. I don't think it's very helpful. I think it's much more helpful to look around the whole of your life and really assess candidly and openly where you are, like right now. What's going on for you? What's going on in terms of where you live, your health, the money you're earning, your relationships, all the people in your life that you love, how you're spending your time, where you are and your personal growth. All these things matter.
How should people deal with imposter syndrome?
Well, first of all, imposter syndrome is very, very common. What I find is because the phrase is now is so well known, people will often just tell me, oh, well, I can feel imposter syndrome coming on. And when I ask them what that means, it's about a fear that they haven't really deserved their success. And underneath that very often is growing up with a feeling that they weren't quite enough, weren't good enough, pretty enough, clever enough, tall enough, sporty enough, well-behaved enough. So one of the things I always do in the first session is I always do an autobiographical account with people where I ask them about those things and what beliefs they acquired about themselves as children. That puts imposter feelings into an early context and helps explain, I think, why people may feel as they do. Another thing I think a coach can do, which is very helpful, is to say, well, let's look at what real imposters are like. So might look at some famous ones, famous con artists, the guy who pretended to be a pilot, people like Lawrence van der Post, who pretended he was an expert on the Bushmen of the Kalahari when he wasn't. And usually when you explain that, people laugh and say, well, no, I'm not, that's not me. Yeah. Then I think it's worth looking at, well, how do we get a bit of perspective on this? And when you say you feel like an imposter, you don't feel like an imposter, presumably in every aspect of your life. Of course, people don't. And often what it's about is uncertainty and lack of confidence in the role that they're doing. So then it's worth looking at, well, where specifically do you feel that? And sometimes I think it's true, people do definitely have a skill that they lack, in which case the coaching can be about, well, let's look at how you could acquire that.
In your book, you write quite a lot about vulnerability, and that it's a key to change. Could you explain a bit more about that? And do you think that men and women respond differently when asked to allow themselves to be vulnerable?
Well, it's impossible to be coached successfully if you don't feel you have permission to be vulnerable. If what you're bringing is your defended self, I'm sure it's exactly the same for therapists and therapy clients. And the first thing any coach has to do really is somehow, and I'm not sure, you've seen in my book that I still don't really know the answer to this, how you do it, but as quickly as possible to create a climate where people feel safe. And I think therapists will talk about containing or holding. And it's just the same in coaching. It has to be okay for a client to tell you what it is they're really worried about. You have to get past the alibi reason for coming to coaching and to the underlying reason. Men and women, well, yeah, I suppose there's a bit of truth in that as a generalization, isn't there? That men might find it a little bit harder, but to be honest, I don't really find that that's that's the case. I've had male clients, you'd have seen descriptions of some in my book, who within minutes really of coming into the room are unwrapping themselves and telling me, well, I've never said this to anyone before, but I've got to say this. And on the other hand, as you'd also have seen, there were and are clients who leave it quite a long time before telling you what the real problem is. And they have to feel their way to the point where they can trust you, because most of us go through life defending ourselves, don't we? We have to present that successful, smiley, calm, whatever it is, in front. It's very unusual to find an environment where it's okay to be vulnerable.